She said it like a joke, but there was nothing playful in her voice. "She doesn't run anything. Let her eat with the staff." Madison didn't raise her volume. She didn't have to. The sentence slid across the polished air of the ballroom sharp enough that the entire table and half the room heard it. I didn't flinch. The two catering staff at my table stiffened. One of them started to rise, mumbling an apology he didn't owe me. I lifted a hand slightly, stopping him before he could speak. This wasn't his humiliation, it was mine. And unlike everyone else in this family, I had learned how to carry my own shame without dropping it on someone weaker. So I didn't argue. I calculated. The seating chart had already told me the story. My parents at table 2, old neighbors, former teachers, investors. Everyone seated where the cameras would catch their best angles. Every name calligraphed in gold ink, perfectly centered. Except mine. Table 14 near the kitchen, the planner had said, smiling too fast. There were some late changes. Of course there were. Table 14 sat by the swinging doors, right where the smell of garlic and roasted lamb poured out every time a server pushed through. The tablecloth was a little wrinkled, the silverware mismatched. It was where you put people you didn't want in photos, or people you didn't consider people at all. "She doesn't run anything," Madison repeated this time to one of her bridesmaids who pretended not to hear but smiled into her champagne. "We'll keep the executives up front." Her arm was looped through my brother's. Jason, the man whose wedding I had flown across the country to attend. The man whose company I had held together through 3 separate financial crises. The man whose future was balanced on a contract that still needed one final signature, mine. My mother stood a few feet away, pretending to adjust ribbon on a floral arrangement that didn't need fixing. My father studied the dance floor as if the parquet could explain how he'd raised a daughter he could push toward the kitchen. No one looked at me. I looked at all of them. At my mother, who once cried because Jason got a C+ in algebra but never noticed my scholarship certificates. At my father, who put CEO on my brother's business cards when he was 24 and left my name off the company website entirely. At Jason, the golden boy, who never learned the difference between charisma and competence because he never had to. He met my eyes for a second, just one. Then he looked away. That silence screamed louder than Madison's insult. It said, "This is deliberate. This is the hierarchy. You know your place." For a moment, something hot and ancient rose behind my eyes. 8-year-old me wanted to shout, to make a scene, to ask them how many different ways they could tell me I didn't belong at their table. But 8-year-old me didn't sign multi-million-dollar agreements. 30-year-old me did. I inhaled slowly, the way I do when a negotiation starts to tilt. The room sharpened the gleam of the crystal, the murmur of guests, the clink of cutlery. The wedding planner hovering nearby, uncertain whether she should usher me back to my assigned exile. The faint buzz of my phone still on silent in my clutch, reminders from people who actually respected my time. They thought I was here as decoration, an obligation. The quiet sister who fetched coffee in board meetings and smiled from the shadows while the real players toasted each other. They forgot who built the numbers they bragged about. They forgot whose strategy had turned Atlas from a failing relic into a company worth merging with. They forgot that the ink on the $30 million deal they were so desperate to close was still dry, still waiting, still mine. I smiled. Not the brittle smile I wore in family photos, not the polite curve I used in boardrooms to make nervous men feel taller. This smile was glassy and precise, honed by years of being underestimated. I reached into my clutch. No trembling fingers, no dramatic flourish. Just muscle memory and intention. One number. Direct line. It rang once. Olivia. My outside counsel's voice came through calm and efficient. "We're ready whenever you cancel the contract," I said. 3 words. Clear, steady, irreversible. On the other end, a heartbeat of silence. He knew what that meant, what it would detonate. "Understood," he replied. Behind me, a spoon clattered to the floor. The planner blinked like a light had just flickered. A server paused mid-step, glancing around as if someone had opened a window. No one else noticed. Not yet. But they would. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my clutch. No grand gesture, no speech. I didn't owe them that. Explanations are a courtesy you give to people who see you as human. I straightened my shoulders and turned away from table 14. Away from the kitchen doors, the smell of garlic, the staff who looked both apologetic and relieved that I wasn't angry with them. I walked through the ballroom past clusters of sequins and tuxedos, past guests who shifted just enough to avoid brushing against me the way people do with servers balancing trays. Madison's laughter floated behind me, bright and brittle. Jason's profile was angled toward a photographer already posing for a future magazine spread about power couples and legacy. They had no idea that the future they'd curated so carefully had just been cut at the root. As I passed my mother, her hand fluttered out, fingers brushing the air inches from my wrist, then falling back as if touching me might smudge her makeup. My father's eyes narrowed, some instinct telling him something was off, but pride and habit kept his questions behind his teeth. I didn't slow. I didn't give them the chance to ask why my expression had gone from wounded to utterly calm. At the doors of the ballroom, I paused, not to look back but to breathe. The music swelled behind me, some overproduced love song about forever. The irony didn't escape me. If you think that was the climax, you're wrong. That was just the moment I stopped playing the role they wrote for me. The real story started the second I stepped through those doors, leaving their glittering empire behind, along with the contract, the merger, and the illusion that I needed any of them to validate what I'd built. Karma doesn't always arrive in rage. Sometimes she shows up in lipstick and heels, carrying a phone full of receipts. And tonight I had just presented the first one. I didn't cry as I walked out of the ballroom. I didn't let myself feel anything yet. There would be time for that later. For now, all I could think about was how predictable it had all been. The insult, the silence, the betrayal. None of it surprised me. Not really. It had always been like this. Long before the contract, long before the wedding, long before Madison ever entered our lives. When I was 8, I remember being called the quiet one by every adult in the room. Not because I was shy, but because I had learned early on that my words didn't carry weight. Jason, 2 years older, was the loud one, the golden boy. The kind of child that walked into a room and sucked up all the air without even meaning to. He had that kind of presence that made people lean in, listen, admire. I had curiosity books and a habit of doing things right the first time, but no one seemed to notice quiet competence when loud charm was in the room. At school, I brought home straight A's. Science fairs, writing contests, debate team. My trophies filled a box under my bed. Participation ribbons for him went on the refrigerator. My parents never made it to a single awards ceremony. Not one. The auditorium applause that echoed around me always felt misdirected, as if it were landing on a version of me they'd never bother to meet. Jason once got a C+ in algebra, and my mother hired a tutor the next day, sitting at the dining table with him for hours, brow furrowed like the world might end if he didn't understand quadratic equations. I remember standing in the doorway clutching a letter from my teacher about a regional scholarship program. No one looked up. The letter eventually went into the same box as my trophies. I remember asking for help with my college applications. My father waved a hand and said, "You'll figure it out. You always do." It sounded like a compliment, but it wasn't. It was dismissal dressed up as faith. Jason, meanwhile, had 3 sets of eyes reviewing his essays, and a private counselor to prep for his interview. I watched him rehearse answers in the mirror while my laptop overheated on my lap in the hallway, because there was no space for both of us at the table. It wasn't that they didn't love me. At least that's what I used to tell myself at night when the house was quiet, and my chest ached in a way I didn't have language for yet. I don't think they meant to be cruel. But in our house, love was measured in attention, and Jason always got the spotlight. I learned how to thrive in the shadows. I didn't ask for much. I didn't rebel. I didn't challenge the system. I just worked, quietly, consistently, invisibly. I got used to the way conversations flowed around me like water around a rock. I was there, but the current never really touched me. When our father started Atlas, he brought Jason in on day 1. Jason was given a desk, a title, and a stack of business cards with his name in bold letters. He was 24 and still left his laundry on the floor, but to my father, he was future leadership. The heir apparent. The brand. I was in college then, juggling classes and part-time jobs. I offered to help with accounting software operational flow, even investor pitches. I knew spreadsheets the way Jason knew small talk. I understood systems, patterns, numbers. My father said, "We'll call you when we need you." They didn't, not for years. There's a particular sting in being told you're reliable only when there's a crisis, as if your value only exists when the house is already on fire. Day to day, you're forgettable. Crisis day, you're essential. But essential doesn't mean respected. It just means convenient. I used to sit in the lobby of Atlas during school breaks waiting for Jason to finish important meetings, watching employees rush around with branded coffee cups. Sometimes they would mistake me for a temp. Once a receptionist handed me a stack of folders and asked if I could run them upstairs because you look like you're headed that way. I ran them upstairs. I knew every floor of that building long before I had a pass card. At home, the pattern was the same in miniature. If Jason missed curfew, I got the lecture about responsibility. If he forgot to lock up after a party, I was told to be more careful about who I trusted. One Thanksgiving, he drove drunk and wrecked a neighbor's fence. My mother cried, my father raged, and then they both turned to me and asked how I could let it happen. I was at college, 3 hours away. They saw me as the one who cleaned up the mess, who made things smooth again. And once the mess was gone, so was I. Forgotten, unacknowledged, expected to disappear until needed again. Even at family dinners, the pattern held. Jason arrived late, told the same stories, repeated the same half-truths, and was rewarded with laughter and praise. I tried once to bring up an idea I had for a non-profit incubator that could partner with Atlas's community initiatives. My mother changed the subject mid-sentence to ask Jason about his golf swing. My father passed the salt without looking at me. Jason cut in with a joke about my old car and the entire table laughed. That was the night I stopped speaking up. Not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. Some tables weren't set for you. You were just expected to serve quietly and move on. I used to lie awake and wonder what it was about me that made them act that way. Was I too serious? Too quiet? Not charming enough? Not loud enough to be real in their eyes? I'd replay conversations in my head, editing my lines, wondering if there was a version of me that would finally be daughter instead of support staff. But the truth is, it had never been about my flaws. It had to do with roles they'd written long before I understood I was in a script. They had assigned them early and no one ever thought to question them. Jason was the future. I was the fallback. He was the face. I was the insurance plan. He was the empire. I was the hands holding the foundation together. People like my parents don't say these things out loud. They don't have to. They communicate it in who gets defended and who gets left hanging. In who gets the seat near the head of the table, and who gets told we ran out of chairs, but you don't mind, right? In whose mistakes get rationalized and whose competence gets rebranded as you're just naturally good at this, and then ignored. As I stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel that night, watching guests arrive in black tie attire, undertones of perfume and champagne laughter drifting through the revolving doors, I realized that they had never seen me clearly, not once. They saw the shape of me but not the substance. They used my skills but never gave them a name. They asked for my loyalty but never offered it in return. I was always the one in the room who understood what needed to be done, but was never asked to speak. The one who read contracts while others toasted to their own brilliance. The one who said yes out of duty, never out of recognition. The one who built quietly so others could take the credit. When you live like that long enough, you start to believe that maybe that is your place. Not because it feels right, but because it's familiar. But even familiarity has a breaking point. I remember the first time I understood that fallback could also mean leverage. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just a small realization sliding into place like a final puzzle piece. If I was the one holding everything together in the background, then I was also the one who knew exactly where to let go. The day I realized they were building their legacy on my silence was the day I stopped believing recognition would ever come. After everything I had done, every late night, every number crunched, every meeting saved at the last second, they still saw Jason as the hero. And they always would. The wedding wasn't an exception. It was the most honest expression of what they believed about me. The girl near the kitchen. the one you sit with the staff, the one you assume will still sign the contract anyway. Atlas wasn't built in a gleaming tower. It was born in our garage, my father's old drafting table shoved between boxes of winter coats and an outdated treadmill no one used. Jason was there on day one, standing beside our father like a prince beside a king. I still remember the way people clapped him on the shoulder, congratulated him, told him he was going places. He was 24. He couldn't balance a checkbook. But he had the right last name and the kind of charisma that made people forget to ask questions. I was still in college then, finishing an economics degree with a minor in systems engineering. I came home on weekends offering to help with whatever needed doing. Data migration, vendor audits, drafting pitch decks, cleaning up supply chain projections that looked like they were drawn by a caffeinated toddler. My father would glance at me, polite and dismissive all at once. "We'll call you when we need you." He said it the way other fathers said, "Drive safe or proud of you." A habit, a reflex. A sentence so familiar he probably didn't even hear himself say it. They didn't call. Jason got a desk. I got silence. Jason got business cards. I got maybe next quarter. Jason got invited to dinners with industry veterans where he sat at linen-covered tables, absorbing the kind of legacy talk that protects mediocre men for generations. I got leftovers in the fridge and a "sorry you missed it." I wasn't jealous. I was painfully aware. Aware that the roles were assigned. Aware that Atlas wasn't built as a family business, it was built as a dynasty with one acceptable heir and one daughter who was expected to clap politely from the wings. The problem was that I didn't want Jason's spotlight. I didn't want his title. I didn't crave applause or magazine covers or interviews. I just wanted to be seen in the room I was already helping hold together. But even that was too much. During one summer break, I asked if I could join a meeting with a potential investor. I'd done most of the prep work. My father waved me off. "It's a room full of older men, sweetheart. They won't take you seriously." He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like it was a fact of nature, like gravity or weather, immutable, unavoidable. He said it like it was for my own good. Jason didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. In our family, silence was its own language, and Jason had always been fluent. So I didn't push, didn't argue, didn't cry. I took my laptop to the kitchen table and worked anyway. I ran numbers, mapped projections, built models Jason didn't understand, and my father didn't ask for. But they used them. They always used my work. They just never gave it a name. For a while I told myself that being useful mattered more than being recognized. That if I worked hard enough, long enough, well enough, they would eventually see me. Maybe not as the heir, but as a partner. As a daughter whose mind was worth listening to. I was wrong. What I didn't know then was that Atlas was already built on fault lines. Not financial ones, emotional ones. Invisible cracks formed by years of favoritism, silence, misplaced faith, and the quiet, corrosive assumption that Jason would always be the center of gravity, and I would always orbit him. The cracks widened slowly at first. Jason made minor mistakes that were quietly fixed by assistants or shrugged off by my father. He double-booked meetings, gave the wrong quarterly targets in a team presentation, signed an MOU without reading the fine print. Little things. Things they dismissed as learning moments. But then the little things grew teeth. Deals slipped, clients left, costs ballooned. And the market shifted in a way Atlas wasn't prepared for, not because the data wasn't there, but because Jason didn't know how to read it, and my father didn't want to admit it. I watched all of it from the edges, powerless and painfully aware. One night during winter break, I found Jason sitting in the dark at the dining table, staring at spreadsheets he clearly didn't understand. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. The confident golden boy shine dimmed into something cracked and frantic. He didn't notice me in the doorway. I waited a few seconds, wondering if he'd ask for help, just once, just something. He rubbed his face, muttered, "Dad will fix it," and closed the laptop. He never saw me. He never thought to. A few months later, Atlas hit a wall harder than any of us expected. The market dipped, funds dried up, clients hesitated, expenses stacked like a house of cards in a windstorm. Jason was named CEO that year, and Atlas was already sinking. My father pulled me aside one afternoon, handed me a stack of outdated manuals, and said, "If you want to help, start by learning the basics." I had already written half the optimization plan he'd spent 6 months pretending to develop. I went home that night and cried for the first time in years. Not because of the insult, but because for the first time I realized no amount of competence would earn me a seat at their table. They didn't want me at the table. They wanted me under it, holding the legs steady while they toasted each other above. But every dynasty built on denial eventually collapses. And Atlas was about to experience its first true crack. A crack that would finally force them to remember I existed not because they wanted me, but because they were running out of options. They didn't know it yet. But the day was coming. And when it arrived, the entire future of Atlas, their empire, their pride, their legacy, would rest in the hands of the girl they'd trained themselves not to see. The crack finally arrived with the sound of a phone call I almost didn't answer. Jason never called me unless something was wrong. And even then it was usually a text short, avoidant, stripped of punctuation the way guilt often is. But that night, nearing midnight, my phone lit up with his name. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to let it ring out like so many of my calls to him had. But the universe has a way of nudging you into roles you never asked for. I answered. His voice was raw, tight. Not the polished charm he used in boardrooms, this was Jason stripped of pretense. "Liv, I need help. Not a greeting, not an apology. Just panic wearing desperation's clothes." He didn't explain over the phone. He didn't have to. I could hear the fear threading through every breath. When I arrived at Atlas the next morning, the elevator opened to an office floor that felt like a ghost story. Empty cubicles. Phones ringing unanswered. Stacks of paper abandoned like people had run out mid-task. It didn't feel like a company. It felt like a crime scene. Jason stood in the middle of the chaos with his jacket off and his tie-loosened hair sticking up like he'd been dragging his hands through it for hours. When he saw me, relief washed over his face so quickly I almost didn't recognize him. "We're 30 days from collapse," he said. That was generous. They were closer to 15. I didn't say "I told you so." I didn't ask why he ignored every early warning sign I'd flagged. I didn't bring up the meeting where he laughed off my concerns in front of the board. Instead, I walked straight to the nearest desk, logged into a system I'd never officially been given access to, and started pulling numbers. Jason paced behind me, firing fragmented explanations into the air, none of them helpful. When I held up a hand to silence him, he stopped talking immediately. Not because he respected me, but because he needed me. That distinction wasn't lost on me. Hours blurred. My hair twisted into a messy knot. Lunch forgotten. Water untouched. By nightfall, I had mapped every artery of the company's financial body and identified exactly where it was bleeding out. I should have walked away. I should have let Atlas collapse and forced them to face the consequences of their arrogance. But I didn't. Some part of me, some wounded loyal part, still wanted to save what I had quietly helped build. So I stayed. For 3 weeks I worked like a surgeon on a dying patient. I consolidated vendors, cut redundancies, discovered duplicate billing, redesigned the operational workflow, rewrote pitches, rebuilt the financial model from the ground up. Jason wandered in and out, looking both grateful and threatened, like he couldn't decide what terrified him more, losing the company or admitting he wasn't capable of saving it himself. When the emergency funding landed $17 million from 3 investors who trusted my numbers more than Jason's smile, the company exhaled for the first time in months. Payroll was saved. Contracts were renewed. Vendors stopped calling in panic. The office lights flickered back to life with something close to hope. Jason held a team meeting afterward, standing in front of the employees with the confidence of a returning hero. He thanked them for their resilience, praised the leadership team, made vague references to hard decisions and innovative strategies. He didn't mention my name, not once. The magazine article came out a month later, the young CEO who rescued his father's legacy. A full-page spread, Jason's arms crossed, Atlas logo glowing behind him. I was barely a footnote, literally. A line at the bottom, special thanks to the operations team. I read the article twice. Then a third time just to make sure I hadn't hallucinated the omission. When I confronted Jason, he shrugged. You know how these things go. Reporters simplify. It's about the brand. No, it wasn't about the brand. It was about the myth. The one where Jason was the destined successor and I was the invisible scaffolding holding him up. The world loves a tidy story. A father builds an empire, a son saves it, a daughter watches from the background. That narrative was too convenient to challenge. But I saw the truth. Atlas was no longer a company. It was a stage. And I was the understudy everyone expected to perform perfectly, then step back into the wings when the curtain rose. I didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't demand credit. I learned something far more important. They would always use my mind as long as I allowed them to ignore my name. And for the first time, a seed of something new took root inside me. Not bitterness, not vengeance, self-recognition. A quiet, steady awareness, if I could save their company in 3 weeks, I could build my own in 3 years. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need to. Power doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, deliberately until the moment it decides to be seen. And mine had just begun. The moment Atlas truly began to crumble didn't arrive with a dramatic explosion. No sirens, no headlines, just a slow tightening of the air like a storm preparing to break. It began with invoices piling in stacks Jason pretended not to see. Then vendors started calling. Then clients stopped returning calls. Then the boardroom, usually full of polished confidence, began to sound like a room of people whispering around a dying patient. But still Jason smiled. Still he shook hands. Still he assured everyone that Atlas was adapting. It was astonishing the way a man could believe his own mythology, even as the numbers bled under his fingertips. I saw it for what it was. A drowning man describing the water as refreshing. I tried at first to warn him quietly, pointed out the discrepancies, showed him the projections, highlighted the pattern of diminishing cash flow. But Jason had inherited one trait my father wore like armor. They both treated warnings from me as background noise. So the crisis grew teeth. By the time I got his midnight call begging for help, Atlas wasn't limping, it was hemorrhaging. And Jason, for the first time in his life, didn't have a script. He looked like a child who had been handed the controls to a plane mid-descent. Live, he said, the words sticking to his throat. We're going under. So I became the thing I had trained myself to be since childhood, the unseen solution. I walked into Atlas the next morning and felt every pair of eyes flick toward me. They didn't smile, didn't greet me, didn't thank me for coming. But their shoulders lowered a fraction, their breaths evened out. As if my presence alone meant failure was no longer inevitable. It was the closest thing I'd ever get to recognition. I didn't take it personally. Desperation isn't admiration. I shut myself into the conference room that had once been my father's war room and began auditing. It didn't take long to find the rot. Duplicate vendors, payments issued twice, bloated contracts signed without reading the fine print, marketing budgets that burned money like incense with no measurable return. Jason had been performing leadership while I had been practicing it. I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night that month. Lived off coffee and vending machine almonds. My hair gained a streak of silver I wouldn't notice until years later. But I kept going. When I reached out to investors, I didn't pitch Atlas as the company Jason pretended it was. I pitched it as the company it could be, lean, structured, efficient, and guided by someone who understood that survival required humility, not ego. And they listened. Not because Jason was CEO, but because I knew their language, the language of numbers, risk, and structure. They signed $17 million, the kind of money that saves a company flickering on life support. Jason announced it in a press conference, smiling like he had personally climbed into the burning wreckage and carried Atlas out on his back. He thanked the board. He thanked the investors. He thanked the incredible team for their support and resilience. He did not thank me. Not in the speech. Not in private. Not in the article the next month that crowned him the young visionary CEO who rescued his father's legacy. It was a full-page spread. Glossy. Triumphant. I remember reading it in the quiet of my office, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. It was as if the entire month I'd spent saving Atlas had been a dream I woke up from alone. When I showed Jason the article, hoping foolishly that he'd acknowledge the omission, he didn't even blink. "You know how this works," he said. "The media needs a face." He didn't notice the way I stopped breathing for a second, didn't see the flicker of realization crossing my features. In that moment, I understood something I should have known all along. Jason didn't erase me out of malice. He erased me out of habit. He had never seen me as part of the story, only part of the scaffolding. And scaffolding doesn't get credit when the building stands tall. But here's the thing about scaffolding. Remove it at the right moment, and the whole structure collapses. I didn't say a word to Jason that day. Didn't argue, didn't protest. Instead, I nodded, tucked the article into my bag, and walked out of the room with a calmness that should have terrified him. Because for the first time I wasn't trying to be part of Atlas. I was preparing to outgrow it, and true crisis has a way of revealing who the real architect is. Jason thought the worst was behind him. He had no idea the real crisis hadn't even started. My father used to say that legacy was like a relay race. One generation passes the baton to the next. He said it often enough that the phrase became background noise, a family mantra repeated at dinners, meetings, holidays. But batons are only passed to the people you see running beside you. And my father never saw me. After he died, the board convened for a family meeting. Except it wasn't a meeting and it wasn't about family. It was a coronation. Jason was announced as CEO, not interim, not acting, not in consideration, CEO. His name was printed on the letterhead before I even walked into the room. They didn't ask my opinion. They didn't review my contributions. They didn't acknowledge that I had saved Atlas less than a year earlier. Someone handed me a packet of tissues because they assumed I might cry. Not from disappointment, but from sentiment. As if I was the emotional one. As if I had ever been the emotional one. I didn't cry. I scanned the document while the board members shook Jason's hand like he had ascended to royalty. He didn't look at me because he didn't have to. In his mind, this was how it had always been meant to play out. The father builds, the son leads, the daughter claps politely from the sidelines. One board member, a man who owed his entire retirement fund to an investor I secured, gave me a small, apologetic smile. A guilt smile. A "we know you helped but politics matter more" smile. He whispered, "We really do value your insight, Olivia." Insight. Not leadership, not authority, not power. Insight. The word you give to someone who does all the work but none of the speaking. They offered me nothing. Not a title, not a role, not even a line on the org chart that acknowledged what I had already done. But they still asked ever so delicately that I continue providing support during the transition. Support. Like I was an assistant. Like I existed to smooth wrinkles in Jason's crown. I nodded through the entire announcement. I even shook Jason's hand. His grip was warm, confident, rehearsed, the handshake of a man who believed the world was doing exactly what it should. I didn't congratulate him. I didn't need to. He didn't notice. After that day, something shifted quietly inside Atlas. Meetings were suddenly held without me. Emails I previously received were forwarded to keep me in the loop as if I wasn't already inside it. Decisions were made by men whose only real qualification was that they had gone golfing with my father at least once. They spoke about expansion strategies I had designed. They referenced risk analyses I had written. They parroted operational changes I had implemented, but they never said my name. Sometimes, sitting in a room full of polished suits and empty vocabulary, I wondered if I was a ghost haunting a company only I remembered building. And the worst part, no one questioned it. Not because they thought it was fair, but because it was familiar. The invisible daughter, the backup plan, the quiet one, the one who would bail them out again when things inevitably cracked, the one who would stay. But I didn't leave, not yet. I observed, I listened. I watched the edges of Atlas fray again, not from external market pressure this time, but from internal arrogance. Jason made decisions based on optics, not outcomes. He chased headlines instead of balance sheets. He prioritized partnerships that made him look powerful rather than partnerships that made the company stable. Atlas needed a leader. It had an actor. I stopped fixing things preemptively. Stopped smoothing over Jason's sloppy forecasts. Stopped rewriting his presentations behind the scenes. Stopped whispering warnings he'd only ignore. It wasn't bitterness, it was strategy. Because I knew something Jason didn't. You cannot save a man who refuses to believe he's drowning. If Atlas fell apart again, and it would, he couldn't blame the market. He couldn't blame the board. He couldn't even blame me. He would only have his own reflection to argue with. While he performed leadership, I started the slow, quiet work of building something no one in that room could see. Something that didn't rely on my family's name or Jason's charisma or the board's favoritism. Something that belonged entirely to me. It started with morning coffees off-site, lunches with founders no one at Atlas would bother meeting, small investments executed through entities no one knew I controlled, conversations with people who actually valued skill over pedigree. The kind of people who didn't care that Jason was the heir of Atlas, only that I was the woman who had once saved it in 3 weeks. I didn't tell a soul, not even the few employees who occasionally thanked me in hushed tones, because I wasn't just planning a future. I was preparing an exit, a quiet exit, a strategic exit, the kind of exit that didn't leave a door ajar but welded it shut. And somewhere between the late-night planning sessions and the secret meetings, I realized something. I was no longer waiting for them to see me. I was building a world where their recognition didn't matter. Legacies can be inherited, but empires, real empires, are built. And I had just started laying the foundation for mine. The cracks in Atlas didn't appear all at once. They spidered slowly, thin fractures beneath polished surfaces easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. But I was always looking, watching, measuring. That's the thing about being the quiet one. People assume you're harmless. They don't realize quiet often comes from seeing everything too clearly. Jason didn't see the cracks. Or maybe he did and pretended they weren't there. Pretending had always been easier for him. So when the headlines announced his engagement, they felt staged, like a press release written before the proposal ever happened. Atlas CEO announces engagement to Fairchild heiress. Her name was Charlotte Fairchild. A polished photograph of the two of them appeared below the headline, Jason wearing that camera-ready half-smile, Charlotte looking like she was born, knowing which angles made her appear both demure and powerful. It wasn't love. It wasn't even subtle. It was strategic. The Fairchild name wasn't just old money, it was money that had survived collapses, recessions, and the kind of scandals that would have turned lesser families into debris. Their empire was built on a simple philosophy: invest when the world is burning, but only if you get to own the ashes. For weeks, Jason didn't mention Charlotte to me. Not a text, not a call, not a casual, "Hey, I'm dating someone." You don't introduce your fiancé to the person whose approval you take for granted. It wasn't until the wedding announcement hit financial media outlets that I started piecing things together. And like all unpleasant truths in my family, it began with paperwork. A legal advisor I trusted, someone who owed me a favor from years back, called me with hesitation in his voice. "I thought you should know," he said quietly, "there's a clause in the draft merger proposal. A 2-signature requirement for all future strategic growth plans." I knew what that meant before he clarified. "Jason," he said, "and you." I leaned back in my chair. The leather creaked. My pulse didn't. The Fairchilds had done something Atlas never did. They saw me. Not emotionally, not personally, but strategically. They knew who kept Atlas alive during the last collapse. They had done their homework. They didn't trust Jason to lead without oversight. And they wanted my signature on every major decision. Jason wasn't marrying Charlotte. He was marrying capital. And I, quiet, invisible, indispensable, was the fine print that made that capital safe. The days leading up to the pre-wedding dinner were a blur of carefully orchestrated events. There were interviews, features, soft launch press releases carefully worded to present the engagement as a romantic union between two powerful families. No one asked what I thought. They never did. The pre-wedding dinner was held at a private club that reeked of exclusivity, mahogany walls, dim lighting waitstaff, who spoke softly enough that wealth echoed louder. When I walked in, heads turned not to greet me, but to assess me. Jason introduced me to Charlotte as if I were a formality. "This is Olivia, my sister. She keeps things running in the background." Charlotte's handshake was soft. Her smile was polished. Her eyes were cold. "You must be very helpful," she said. Helpful. The word people use when they want to acknowledge your labor without acknowledging your value. I sat through the dinner quietly observing the dynamics. Jason's laugh was louder than usual, Charlotte's posture, perfect Warren Fairchild's gaze sharp enough to slice through the tablecloth. Warren didn't speak much, but when he did, the room shifted. After dessert, he approached me, not Jason, not my mother, not even the board member sitting 2 seats away. Me. He shook my hand, held my gaze a second longer than polite, and said, "We're counting on your cooperation to make this partnership seamless. Not a request, a warning." Jason saw the interaction and hurried over his expression too tight. "Don't make this difficult," he whispered to me as if I were a child about to embarrass him in public. "It's just a formality. We need this deal. We..." That word again. We meant Jason and Charlotte. We meant the board. We meant the public image they wanted to project. We did not include me. I didn't respond. I didn't owe him one. I left the dinner early, the sound of champagne clinking following me out into the cold night air. The city lights reflected against the windows of the club behind me, perfect, curated, orchestrated. Just like the engagement. Just like the merger. Just like the narrative they wanted to build. A narrative I was expected to sign off on with the flick of a pen. But power, real power, doesn't come from signatures. It comes from knowing when not to sign. As I walked to my car, the wind stinging my cheeks, I understood something clearly for the first time in years. Jason wasn't the one with leverage. Charlotte wasn't. Warren wasn't. I was. They just hadn't realized it yet. But they would. The morning of the signing felt deceptively ordinary. Soft gray sky. Muted sunlight. The kind of weather that makes people believe life will unfold exactly as expected. I woke early, made coffee, and moved through my routine with a calm so steady it almost felt borrowed. On the outside, I looked composed, hair pinned back, blazer-pressed pen neatly clipped to my folder. Inside, everything was suspended, not tense, not panicked, just still. A quiet before something I couldn't yet name. The final contract sat on my desk in a pristine black folder. The pages were crisp, the signatures already in place. Jason's, the board's, the Fairchild legal teams. Only one line remained empty. Mine. 30 seconds of ink. That was all they needed from me. After that, I would become irrelevant. That was the plan. I sat at my desk, fingers wrapped around my coffee cup, forcing myself to read the opening page again. Strategic Growth Partnership Agreement. A merger. A lifeline. A leash. My name appeared deep in the legal text, the co-founder's signature requirement the Fairchilds insisted on. A clause Jason never mentioned. A condition no one intended to explain. I tried to convince myself that this was just another transaction. Another sacrifice for the sake of family. Another moment of being useful without being acknowledged. I told myself it wasn't personal. I even believed it for a breath. Then my laptop pinged. A forwarded email. Subject line FW signature confirmation request. At first I assumed it was from an assistant coordinating logistics, the kind of administrative noise that fills corporate mornings. I almost ignored it. But something, a flicker of instinct sharpened by years of being underestimated, made me click. And there it was. A thread. An internal conversation. My name highlighted in a line that wasn't meant for me. Charlotte had forwarded the message. Accidentally. Below it was her note to Jason. Once she signs, we're done babysitting her. She'll be irrelevant. I stared at the words. Read them once. Twice. A third time slower, as if repetition might soften them. They didn't soften. They sliced. The room didn't move, but I felt everything shift. Something cold slid down my spine. My vision tunneled and then cleared sharper than before. Irrelevant, babysitting, done with me. There it was, the truth dressed in the casual cruelty of people who have never learned to see the value of a person unless it benefits them. They weren't just planning to cut me out. They were confident I would let them. My fingers trembled only for a second. A single involuntary tremor of disbelief. Then they stilled. Not because I forced them, but because clarity settled over me like a second skin. Of all the betrayals I'd lived through, this was the most precise. Not emotional, not impulsive, strategic, calculated. They needed my signature, not my voice, not my leadership, not my presence, just my compliance. They thought I was the kind of person who would sign away her own power because family told her to. They thought I was so desperate for recognition that I'd settle for inclusion without agency. They thought I would disappear quietly again. But something broke open inside me, a soundless seismic shift. A recognition so clean it almost felt like relief. For the first time I wasn't hurt. I was awake. A laugh escaped me, soft, not gentle. A laugh with an edge. Not humor. Understanding. The kind of laugh you let out when someone reveals the last missing piece of a puzzle you've been assembling with your eyes closed. I closed the folder slowly, savoring the finality of the motion. Then I highlighted the email thread. Pressed forward. Typed a short instruction to my personal legal advisor, the one who never asked questions he wasn't supposed to. Hold everything. No explanation. He didn't need one. Then I stood smoothing the front of my blazer. The pen lay untouched on the desk. The contract sat unsigned. Across the city, I imagined Jason refreshing his inbox, waiting for the confirmation that his sister, the dependable, quiet, predictable sister, had once again saved the day. He would wait, and wait, and wait. Because I had no intention of signing away power to people who saw me as a burden to tolerate. Not now. Not ever. They thought they'd cornered me. Instead, they had handed me the match and pointed me toward the fuse. I walked out of the study with a stillness I hadn't felt in years. Not rage, not sorrow, certainty. The certainty of someone who finally sees the game for what it is and realizes she's been holding the winning card the entire time. I didn't slam the study door. I didn't storm into Jason's office. I didn't make a scene worthy of a family drama. I simply walked away. Because explosions are loud. But demolition, the kind that truly changes the shape of a landscape, is quiet. And for years I'd been building something far away from the noise of Atlas. It didn't start with a master plan. It began with small, careful decisions. Places where no one looked because no one believed I existed outside the walls of the company they controlled. A Delaware LLC with an innocuous name. A trust administered by a lawyer whose photo didn't appear anywhere online. A handful of friends I trusted enough to put their names on documents when mine would draw attention. When you spend a lifetime being unseen, you learn how to use that invisibility. And I turned it into strategy. The first founders I backed didn't meet me in the gleaming boardrooms where Jason performed his version of leadership. They met me in diners, cafes near train stations, crowded food halls where conversations blended into white noise, people who were overlooked, underestimated, just like me. Maya and Luis were the first. They had a product that looked boring to everyone except the people who needed it most, quiet software for banks struggling with legacy systems no one wanted to touch. They'd been rejected by 12 funds dismissed as too niche, too technical, not flashy enough. But I listened, really listened. Where Jason saw branding, I saw infrastructure. Where the board saw risk, I saw inevitability. I asked them to walk me through their worst-case scenarios twice. Once for accuracy, once for honesty. Then I wrote them a check. Funds transferred via Harbor 12 Holdings, my quiet entity, the one that didn't show up on any glossy lists. 18 months later, their software sat quietly behind the operations of 3 mid-sized banks. They called me, voices shaking with excitement, to say they'd finally paid themselves real salaries. They didn't thank Atlas. They thanked me, by my first name. Next came Ruth. She didn't pitch me an empire. She pitched me possibility. She bought derelict warehouses, everyone else ignored places where paint peeled from the brick and rats darted between broken pallets. She saw cheap real estate in neighborhoods with potential, and she turned those wrecked spaces into mixed-use buildings, clinics on the ground floor, apprenticeship studios upstairs. When I toured her first completed building, the lights flickering in a hallway that smelled faintly of paint and hope, she turned to me and said, "You believed in this before I did." She didn't know the half of it. Then there was Ahmed, a quiet genius who built a payment rail designed for tradespeople and contractors, people who lived one late paycheck away from quitting entirely. His system guaranteed settlement by sundown, no delays, no excuses. People can't plan their lives around banks, he told me. He was right. And then Alondra, a single mother who built a micro-lending model that didn't punish people for emergencies. She grew up watching neighbors drown in overdraft fees because their car broke down at the wrong time. Her model saved lives quietly without spotlight or applause. None of these founders fit the mold of the next big thing. None of them fit the archetype Jason paraded around to impress investors. They didn't come from wealth. They didn't dress for magazine covers. They didn't speak in buzzwords. But they understood something everyone at Atlas forgot. Real value isn't loud. It's precise. It's persistent. It's built from the ground up, not announced from a stage. And piece by piece, project by project, deal by deal, a quiet but formidable network grew, one no one in my family even knew existed. My network didn't need my last name. Didn't need the Atlas legacy. Didn't need my father's mythology. It grew because I showed up. Because I listened. Because I executed. When I look back now, I realize something simple. I hadn't been waiting for Atlas to give me a seat at the table. I'd been building my own table one plank at a time. A table crowded with people who respected me not because of obligation or lineage, but because I'd earned it. People who didn't need me to sit in the shadows so someone else could shine. People who didn't confuse my quiet with weakness. People who didn't just want my signature, they wanted my insight. As my investments grew, so did the pattern: banking software, mixed-use redevelopment, trade payment rails, micro-lending ecosystems. They weren't random, they were infrastructure, interconnected, complementary, stable. Together they formed a quiet empire, one that could withstand storms Atlas couldn't see coming. And the best part, no one in my family had the faintest idea. They believed I lived in the shadow of Atlas. But Atlas had been living in the shadow of me. The day I refused to sign the $30 million contract was not a rebellion. It was alignment. I wasn't blowing up my family's future. I was finally choosing mine. When I walked out of my study that morning, leaving the unsigned contract resting on my desk like a trap I refused to step into, I expected the world to feel different. It didn't. The air smelled the same. The streets hummed with their usual rhythm. People hurried past me on the sidewalk, clutching coffees, scrolling phones, living lives unaware that mine had shifted tectonically. But I felt it. A quiet, profound shift under my ribs. The kind of shift that comes when you finally choose yourself over the role you were assigned. I didn't drive to the office. I didn't return emails. I didn't respond to the 3 missed calls from Jason or the 2 from the Atlas COO. Instead, I drove to the only place that had ever felt completely mine, a small loft I leased under a different name. It was where I met founders, reviewed projections, and made decisions that actually mattered, where every ounce of effort came back to me directly, cleanly, respectfully. No shadows, no borrowed pride, no stolen credit. As I climbed the narrow staircase to the loft, sunlight filtered through the dusty window panes, casting long beams across the hardwood floor. It was silent inside. Peaceful. Mine. I sat at the wide wooden table in the center of the room and opened my laptop. I didn't check Atlas emails. I opened a private portal instead, the dashboard no one else knew existed. 13 companies. 42 active projects. Hundreds of employees whose livelihoods were tied not to Jason's name, but to my decisions. My decisions. The weight of that hit me all at once, clean and clarifying. I had been living in 2 worlds, one where I was invisible, and one where I was irreplaceable. Atlas had always kept me small. But here in this loft, filled with the hum of ambition and real impact, I felt expansive, unrestricted, unmanaged, unclaimed. I scrolled through updates from founders, a photo of Ruth's newest building ribbon cutting children holding balloons, a short video from Ahmed demonstrating his new payout app, a voice note from Maya and Luish thanking me for believing in them before anyone else did. Their gratitude hit differently than anything Atlas ever gave me. It wasn't obligation, it wasn't politeness, it was recognition. A kind of recognition my family wasn't capable of giving. My phone vibrated again. Jason, then a second later, my mother, then a third, an Atlas board member. The messages came rapid fire. We need you to come in today. Where are you? Jason is panicking. Olivia, the Fairchild team, is asking for an update. We assumed the contract would be signed by now. Your brother is expecting confirmation. Please don't make this difficult. Don't make this difficult. The family motto, translated sacrifice yourself so he doesn't have to face consequences. I set the phone face down. The truth was simple. They didn't want me. They wanted what I could do for them. But the moment I refused to sign, they realized something none of them had ever considered. Their stability was an illusion built on my compliance. Jason's success, my strategies, Atlas's survival, my restructuring, the Fairchild deal, my required signature. My silence had been their foundation, and now that silence was gone. I didn't answer the calls, not then, not for hours. I took a long breath, inhaling the scent of fresh paper, old wood, and freedom. Then I opened a document titled Harbor 12 Long-Term Strategy. It wasn't a fantasy, it wasn't a backup plan, it was an empire, 3 phases, 7 years, all of it executable without Atlas, without Jason, without my parents, without anyone who had ever looked at me and seen a placeholder instead of a person. As I reviewed my notes tracing the map of what my future could look like, untethered from the weight of inherited expectations, a realization settled into my bones. I hadn't left Atlas. I had outgrown it. My phone buzzed again. This time the message was different. It was from Charlotte. Cold, efficient, calculated. We need your signature today. No greeting, no pleasantries, no subtlety, just entitlement packaged as urgency. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no pain, no vindication, just clarity. And with that clarity came the first step toward the fall they never saw coming. Because they believed I was trapped. They believed I had no identity without Atlas, that I was tethered by loyalty habit blood. They believed the contract held leverage over me. But leverage only exists if both sides need something. And for the first time in my life, I needed nothing from them. It began quietly, not with explosions, not with accusations, not with screaming, just silence. The kind of silence that creeps into a building when its foundation finally realizes it's missing a pillar. At Atlas, the morning started like any other executives, sipping coffee, assistants juggling schedules, the board pretending they were in control of the narrative. But beneath all that choreography, panic simmered, because the contract wasn't signed, and without my signature, the $30 million Fairchild deal meant nothing. Not delayed, not renegotiated. Dead. Jason called me 10 times before noon. The 12th call wasn't Jason. It was Warren Fairchild. I didn't answer. I imagined the scene unfolding at Atlas with perfect clarity because I knew exactly how these people behaved when power shifted. Jason would be pacing, yanking at his tie, insisting I always come through. My mother would be smoothing her blouse, whispering excuses about how sensitive I could be. Board members would be arguing behind closed doors, some urging calm, others calculating how to protect their own reputations. Charlotte would be the only one not panicking. She would be furious. Because people like her, people who move through life expecting compliance, don't crumble when plans fall apart. They sharpen, and sharpened people are dangerous. But not to me. Charlotte's danger had always relied on one assumption, that I cared enough to play the role she assigned me, and I didn't. Not anymore. By midday, the texts escalated. We need you here immediately. You're jeopardizing everything. The Fairchilds are threatening to pull out. Where are you? This is your family too." Ah. There it was. The weapon they always reached for when the cracks started to show family. As if the word alone erases betrayal. As if shared blood justifies expectation without reciprocity. As if loyalty is something owed rather than earned. My phone buzzed again, another message from Jason. "If you don't sign today, everything falls apart." And for the first time I understood something painfully, beautifully true. Everything was supposed to fall apart. It was the only way something new, something real could be built. I didn't reply. Back at Atlas. The conference room was a pressure cooker. Jason sat at the head of the table, his usual confidence hollowing into something brittle. His hands shook as he shuffled papers that didn't matter anymore. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, insisting to anyone who would listen that Olivia must be overwhelmed, and this isn't like her, as if they'd ever bothered to know what I was like. My father, stoic and silent, stared at the empty chair I used to fill during crises, as if staring hard enough might make me appear. Charlotte was the first to break. She leaned forward, voice icy enough to frost the windows. "Why didn't she sign?" Jason swallowed hard. She's probably just being dramatic." Charlotte scoffed. "No, dramatic people want attention." "Then she doesn't want attention. She wants control." Silence. It wasn't wrong, just incomplete. I didn't want control of Atlas. I wanted control of myself. A concept foreign to people who believed power was inherited rather than earned. Warren Fairchild, silent until now, finally spoke his voice, slow, measured, lethal. "You told me she would sign without issue." Jason stiffened. "She always comes through." I swear Warren raised a hand. "No, she's not coming through. She's walking away." My mother gasped. My father clenched his jaw. Jason went pale. "But she wouldn't do that to us." Warren leaned back. "She already has." Meanwhile, in my loft, I sat cross-legged on the wooden floor reviewing projections for one of my portfolio companies. A soft breeze slipped through the cracked window, carrying sounds of city life, traffic, laughter, footsteps. Real life. A life I finally felt connected to. My phone buzzed once more, this time with a video call request from Jason. I stared at the screen, then let it ring out, again and again and again, until the ringing stopped and was replaced with a single desperate message. "Please, we need you." There it was. Not manipulation, not entitlement, not authority, need. Genuine, raw, unvarnished. And for a moment, just a small one, I felt something almost like pity. Not for Jason the CEO, but for Jason the boy who had always expected the world to bend for him, until it didn't. But pity is not the same as obligation. I put my phone on silent. Then I returned to work on the empire I built with my own hands, not because I needed to escape Atlas, but because I finally understood I had never belonged there. And the moment I refused to sign that contract was the moment their empire began to collapse and mine began to rise. Atlas didn't crumble in one dramatic moment. It unraveled piece by piece, thread by thread, every strand connected to the signature I refused to give. By the next morning, the panic inside the company had shifted from urgent to catastrophic. Emails bounced between executives like sparks in a dry forest. Board members stopped pretending everything was under control. Assistants whispered in hallways, passing scraps of gossip like survival kits. And at the center of it all, Jason sat in his glass office, the king of a kingdom built on sand. When the Fairchilds officially withdrew the deal, citing lack of internal cohesion, the cracks turned to fractures. The board demanded answers. Investors demanded meetings. Vendors demanded payment. And Jason, he demanded me. He called again, and again, and again. When I didn't answer, he tried a different tactic. He showed up at my penthouse. I wasn't there. He tried my parents' house. I wasn't there. He tried the Atlas office. I wasn't there either. For the first time in his life, Jason couldn't find me. That terrified him more than anything. Inside the Atlas boardroom, the board chair slammed his hand against the table. "You told us she would sign Jason." Jason's voice cracked. She always does. She never." But the sentence died in his throat. Because for the first time in his life, he heard how pathetic that sounded. Charlotte, arms crossed, looked at him like he was a child who'd broken something expensive. "We trusted your assurance," she said coldly. "That was a mistake." Jason's face twisted. "Why is everyone acting like this is my fault? Olivia is the one," my mother interrupted, voice shaky. "Jason, what did you say to her? What did you do?" "What did I do?" he snapped, the mask slipping. "Nothing." She's being dramatic. She should have known her place. Silence. A deadly one. My father closed his eyes. Charlotte leaned forward. "There's something you need to understand, Jason." Her voice was blunt, surgical. "Olivia wasn't the weak link in this deal." Jason blinked. She was the asset. Every head turned. Charlotte continued, "Your sister is the one the investors respected. She's the reason the Fairchilds were willing to merge in the first place. We didn't need Atlas. We needed her." The words hit harder than any slap. My mother gasped. My father's jaw tightened. A few board members exchanged wide-eyed glances. "Jason!" He looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under him. "That's ridiculous," he whispered. She's just..." He never finished the sentence, because there was no way to finish it without sounding like the fool he was. Charlotte didn't let him recover. "We've reviewed the internal reports," she said. "The restructuring that saved Atlas 2 years ago, Olivia. The investor pitches that brought in emergency capital, Olivia. The operational model that stabilized your overhead, Olivia." She sat back, crossing one leg over the other. "The only thing you contributed was your last name." My mother burst into tears. My father stood face flushing a dangerous red. And Jason wilted. He looked at his hands as if expecting them to hold the answers. They held nothing. For the first time in his life, the world didn't rearrange itself to accommodate his failures. It held a mirror to them. Meanwhile, in my loft, I sat at my wooden table reviewing a proposal from a startup focused on supply chain automation for small agricultural co-ops. The founder's pitch deck was unpolished, the margins tight, the idea brilliant. My investments weren't about power. They were about building things that mattered. I was reading through a projected cost model when my phone buzzed. Not with a call, but with a message from an unknown number. "You don't know me, but I wanted to say thank you. My wife got a job in one of Ruth's buildings. She's safer now. Please don't stop doing what you're doing." Warmth bloomed unexpectedly in my chest. No manipulation, no entitlement, no pressure, just gratitude. My world was small in scale compared to Atlas's grand facade, but it was real. There were moments I wondered if I should feel guilty, if I'd been too ruthless, if declining the contract had been selfish. But every time those thoughts surfaced, another message came. Another update. Another reminder that my work had purpose beyond being someone's hidden scapegoat. I wasn't abandoning a family that loved me. I was walking away from a cage that kept shrinking the more I grew. At Atlas, the dam burst. Jason slammed his fist against the wall of his office, voice cracking as he shouted at the board, "I am the CEO. This is my company." A board member replied quietly, "No, Jason. This was never your company. It was your father's. And Olivia kept it alive." Jason finally broke. He sank into his chair, hands covering his face. I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. For the first time in his life, he told the truth. He didn't know. He never had. Back in my loft. My phone buzzed again. Another message, not angry, not desperate, just 3 words, from my father. "Come home. Please." I stared at the screen for a long moment. A year ago, that message would have shattered me. Today, it didn't even crack the surface. Because I finally understood something they never did. Home isn't where you're needed. Home is where you're valued. And Atlas had never been my home. I didn't respond to my father's message. Not because I wanted to punish him, not because I hated him, but because going back returning home would have meant stepping willingly into the role they had carved out for me since childhood. The quiet one, the fixer, the fallback, the invisible daughter who appeared only when the family needed saving. I wasn't that person anymore. The moment I refused to sign that contract, I didn't just walk away from Atlas. I walked away from my silence. And silence had been the currency they used to control me. At Atlas, the fallout accelerated. The Fairchilds released an official statement citing instability in leadership and lack of internal alignment. Investors panicked. Stockholders demanded emergency explanations. Board members began arranging private meetings with legal counsel, every man for himself. Money stops being loyal the moment confidence collapses. Suddenly, Jason's charisma had no weight. His confidence had no currency. His title had no power. Without me holding up the structure, Atlas was exactly what I always knew it to be, a legacy built on optics and entitlement. The board called for an emergency meeting. Jason was asked to step down temporarily. Temporarily. The corporate word for, we need a scapegoat while we figure out how screwed we are. He tried reaching me again. No voicemail, no long speech, just one broken sentence. Please, talk to me. I didn't answer. His apology would have meant nothing without recognition. He wanted my help, not my healing. At my parents' house. My mother sat at the dining table staring at a cold cup of tea. My father paced, running a hand through his graying hair, something he only did when the world refused to bend to his will. She's our daughter, my mother whispered. My father didn't answer. She tried again. We pushed her away. Still nothing. Then, more quietly, we didn't protect her. My father stopped pacing. That's not fair. She never said anything. She stopped saying anything, my mother corrected, because none of us ever listened. It was the closest they had ever come to admitting the truth. But even then, truth spoken too late loses its power. Meanwhile, in my loft, I sat surrounded by whiteboards, spreadsheets, and a dozen parallel futures. My future. A future that no longer needed their permission. I reviewed the next phase of Harbor 12. A new fund focused on underserved founders in rural communities, partnerships with microfinance banks, acquisition of low-profit but high-impact infrastructure companies. Not glamorous, not headline-grabbing, real, sustainable, mine. Success no longer felt like validation. It felt like liberation. As I worked, sunlight spilled across the table, warming the papers, my hands, my skin. A quiet reminder that life outside Atlas was not only possible, it was already happening. My phone buzzed with a new message, this one from Maya. We're expanding to 3 new states. Couldn't have done this without you. Another from Alondra. A woman told me today that our loan saved her home. I wanted you to know. Then Ahmed, we hit our first $1 million in processed payments. You believed in this before anyone else. Every message felt like a brick laid in a foundation that was mine alone. Recognition, not demanded, not begged for, earned, seen, shared. Then, the unexpected call. Not from Jason, not from my parents, not from anyone who wanted to drag me back into the dark gravity of Atlas. It was from a woman named Teresa, a founder in the Midwest whose tiny logistics startup I'd funded last year. Her voice was warm-edged with emotion. Olivia? I just wanted to say, people like you don't come around often. I laughed softly. You don't even know me. But she did. Maybe not your childhood, maybe not your last name. But I know this when the rest of the world looks over someone you don't. You look closer. Something in my chest loosened. She continued, my daughter wants to go into business. I tell her about you. How you're proof that women don't have to wait to be given a seat. They can build one. Her words hit deeper than she could possibly understand. For years, I'd been the invisible one. Yet here, far outside the gilded halls of Atlas, I was visible in ways that mattered. Not for being loud, not for being flashy. Not for being a name on a headline, but for being someone who built quietly and precisely, someone who lifted others as she rose, someone who didn't need an empire to inherit because she was creating one from scratch. Far from Atlas, I realized something profound. My family had always mistaken my silence for weakness. They thought still waters meant no depth. They thought lack of noise meant lack of power. They thought if they didn't acknowledge me, the world wouldn't either. They were wrong. Silence isn't the absence of strength. Silence is where strength is forged. My quiet was never submission. It was preparation. And now that I had stepped into the light of my own making, I didn't need Atlas. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their table. I had built my own. And people were already gathering around it. Because I wasn't the quiet one anymore. I was the woman who walked away from an empire and built a better one.